He didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights. It had to be some silly little communist. When I was at Newsweek magazine, which, this really sounds like I walked 4 miles in the snow to school, but I started at Newsweek magazine in 1963, which was before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so it was actually legal to discriminate against women, and Newsweek did. It is distressing to me that we live in an age in which we still must fight to protect our civil rights as Americans, in which a hate crime perpetrated against someone based their sexual orientation can go unpunished, and in which discrimination is being written into our laws. The most memorable interviews for me are folks whose names I don't know, young civil rights leaders in the South, showing great courage as they walked into a town in the dark of night. A doctor working for Doctors Without Borders in Somalia, operating by kerosene light in a tent. Those are the kinds of people that linger in your memory. The social issues outside of football are not as defined as they were earlier, when integration took place and certain rights were legislated. The civil rights movement is over. Individuals can buy homes wherever they want, travel first class wherever they want, eat wherever they want. Forgiveness became a big part of the civil rights movement, juxtaposed against the violence of protesters and law enforcement. King described forgiveness in one of his early sermons as a pardon, a process of life, and the Christian weapon of social redemption. Young people have this almost romantic attachment to civil rights, liberties, emancipating people from oppression, etc. The idea that such oppression exists in this country offends me, but it's able to be pushed and sold because education in this country is so woefully incompetent and inept. Abolition didn't just happen, people made it happen. Women's suffrage didn't just happen, people made it happen. Civil rights legislation didn't just happen, people made it happen. And marriage equality didn't just happen either, people made it happen. Sometimes, I am also identified as a civil rights leader or a human rights activist. I would also like to be thought of as a complex, three-dimensional, flesh-and-blood human being with a rich storehouse of experiences, much like everyone else, yet unique in my own way, much like everyone else. All civil rights and the right to hold office were to be extended to persons of any Christian denomination. My image had always been very heterosexual, very straight, so it was a nice experience for me, a chance to clarify my own feelings about gay and lesbian civil rights. There is no contradiction between effective law enforcement and respect for civil and human rights. Dr. King did not stir us to move for our civil rights to have them taken away in these kinds of fashions. I think there are a whole host of things that are civil rights, and then there are other things, such as traditional marriage, that, I think, express a community's concern and regard for a particular institution. My father wanted me to be a dentist like him, or any doctor, really. There was this attitude of, the civil rights movement was not about you being an artist. There's a very big gulf between the black civil rights leadership in America and the black middle class in America. The black middle class are conservative. Many of those minorities can be persuaded to be members of the Republican Party. Progress is possible, but it is fragile, and across our country, the battles for our most basic civil rights rage on. The South resented giving the Afro-American his freedom, the ballot box and the civil rights law. As President Trump quickly moved to limit immigration, civil rights, and environmental protections, I felt fear for my young children, and guilt, too, as if I'd somehow betrayed the unspoken contract all parents make to give our children a better life than ourselves. I was the first tenured woman at Columbia. That was 1972, every law school was looking for its woman. Why? Because Stan Pottinger, who was then head of the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, was enforcing the Nixon government contract program. When it came to political power, blacks need not apply. Add to this steaming stew the growing tensions over the Vietnam War and the movement for civil rights, and you had plenty of elements to fire the imagination of a novice journalist. The greatest movement for social justice our country has ever known is the civil rights movement, and it was totally rooted in a love ethic. There's no problem on the planet that can't be solved without violence. That's the lesson of the civil rights movement. Too often, advances in civil rights or women's rights are undermined by wrong-headed legislation or weak-kneed political leadership. The civil rights movement, it wasn't just a couple of, superstars like Martin Luther King. It was thousands and thousands, millions, I should say, of people taking risks, becoming leaders in their community. During the 60s, I was, in fact, very concerned about the civil rights movement. My father's leadership was about more than civil rights. He was deeply concerned with human rights and world peace, and he said so on numerous occasions. He was a civil rights leader, true, but he was increasingly focused on human rights and a global concern and peace as an imperative. Even as we continue to carry the banner of civil rights and environmental justice, we've also got to focus on many, many people. For them, life starts with a good job. A lot of things happened in a lot of places, and to see how well it was handled in Atlanta. There are a lot of reasons for Atlanta being a special town in the civil rights era. A little less complaint and whining, and a little more dogged work and manly striving, would do us more credit than 1,000 civil rights bills. The civil rights movement was based on faith. Many of us who were participants in this movement saw our involvement as an extension of our faith. We saw ourselves doing the work of the Almighty. Segregation and racial discrimination were not in keeping with our faith, so we had to do something. I maintain that every civil rights bill in this country was passed for white people, not for black people. All we want is to carry out the greatest expression of a free democracy and vote on Catalonia's future. This is not about independence. It is about fundamental civil rights and the universal right of self-determination. I feel that my father's greatest legacy was the people he inspired to get involved in public service and their communities, to join the Peace Corps, to go into space. And really that generation transformed this country in civil rights, social justice, the economy, and everything. The Obama years will be remembered as a cultural, and legal, tipping point for equality for all people who do not identify as strictly heterosexual, arguably the civil rights movement of our times. The President signed the bill repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The Defense of Marriage Act was struck down by the Supreme Court. I think that the thing that we learned back in the day of the civil rights movement is that you do have to keep on keeping on. One individual can begin a movement that turns the tide of history. Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, Mohandas Gandhi in India, Nelson Mandela in South Africa are examples of people standing up with courage and non-violence to bring about needed changes. It is our responsibility to stand up for equality, fairness, and civil rights. I was very much a part of the civil rights era, so, of course, my fantasy was to marry some outstanding black gentleman, a leader, someone like Martin Luther King who was doing something for black people. When people discuss the 1960s and the great civil rights era, they often speak in romantic terms as if there wasn't immense work put in, and as if there wasn't immense sacrifice that took place. But none of those battles were easily fought and won, there were sustained movements behind them. Nothing has been more detrimental to me than to be considered a symbol, because I never stood for any of that. The civil rights movement thought they would do me harm over the years by disassociating themselves from me. Well, nothing in the world was more to my advantage. I was never one of them. I had my own divine mission. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as our Prince of Peace, of civil rights. We owe him something major that will keep his memory alive. We can't understand what we've accomplished on civil rights without telling the story of Bayard Rustin. And now, we must write the next chapter in the American civil rights story by drawing strength and inspiration from his moral courage. Anyone who said he wasn't afraid during the civil rights movement was either a liar or without imagination. I was scared all the time. My hands didn't shake, but inside I was shaking. That's what he was saying, the civil rights movement. Judge me for my character, not how black my skin is, not how yellow my skin is, how short I am, how tall or fat or thin, it's by my character. Growing up, my birthday was always Confederate Memorial Day. It helped to create this profound sense of awareness about the Civil War and the 100 years between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement and my parents' then illegal and interracial marriage. One of the triumphs of the Civil Rights Movement is that when you travel through the South today, you do not feel overwhelmed by a residue of grievance and hate. We must continue to prove to the world that we can provide a rising standard of living for all men without loss of civil rights or human dignity to any man. Without prayer, without faith in the Almighty, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. In the 1950s, the black men and women and their white allies who fought for civil rights and basic human dignity could look to the federal government. If the racist sheriff and his troops beat them with batons or sprayed them and their children with water cannons, the Attorney General would act. If you look at the history of other movements, whether civil rights or environmental rights, these are all decades-long undertakings. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.